There is a kind of quiet that only settles over still water in the dark. It is not peace. It is the water holding its breath, the way a room goes quiet when someone has just stopped speaking. Out on the old canal at Harrow Lock, as one man learned across a single winter, the water there holds more than its breath. It holds a name, and it has been waiting a long time for someone to say it out loud. Good evening. Come in out of the cold and sit with me a while before we walk out along that towpath, because this is a story that keeps to the dark and the damp, and it does not hurry. I'm the one who gathers these tales, the ones people carry quietly for half their lives, the ones they only tell you late with the fire low, when they have decided they can trust you with the weight of it. Tonight's came to me from a man who spent one winter as a relief keeper on a lock far out in the flat country, and who told me he has slept with a light on ever since. So settle back, and let me tell you about a lock, a bell, and a name that would not stay drowned. The man at the heart of this had come to the waterways the way tired men come to quiet work, because he wanted somewhere the world could not easily find him. He had lost someone, that autumn, in a way he did not talk about, and the Canal Company had a winter posting they could not fill. Relief keeper at Harrow Lock, out in the fen country, from the freezing of the water to the thaw. They told him the pay was small and the nights were long, and the nearest village was 4 miles off down an unlit road. He told them that suited him. He did not yet know that a lonely place does not cure loneliness. It only gives it room to grow and something to grow toward. Harrow Lock sat on a forgotten stretch of the old canal, where the working boats had all but stopped coming, and the water lay flat and black between its banks for miles. There was the lock itself, 2 sets of great timber gates, and the deep stone chamber between them where a boat would rise or fall with the water. And beside it the keeper's cottage, low and damp, with a stove and a cot and one window that looked out on the gates. On a post by the upper gate hung an iron bell, green with age, that a boatman would ring in the night to wake the keeper and ask to be let through. And all around, in every direction, the fen, reeds and mist and the far-off cry of birds, and no light anywhere but the one in his own window. He came out on the last gray afternoon before the hard frost, and the man who handed over the keys was the old keeper going off for the winter. And I want you to hold on to what that old man said, because it comes back around. He walked the new keeper along the gates and showed him the great iron handles that wound them open and shut, and the sluices that let the water through, and last of all the green bell on its post. And what he said about the bell, put into my own words, was this: if it rings in the night, you get up and you look. If there is a boat, you let them through, and God help them being out on the water this time of year. But if you go out and there is no boat, if the bell is ringing and the water is empty, you do not answer it. You do not work the gates. You go back inside and you shut the door and you let it ring itself out. Whatever you do not open the lock to an empty chamber. The new keeper took that for the fussiness of an old man handing over a thing he had loved too long, and he thanked him, and watched him walk away down the towpath until the mist took him. Then he went inside and lit the stove, and listened to the first night come down over the fen, the reeds moving, the water ticking against the gates, the deep cold settling in the stone. And for those first nights at least, the bell hung silent on its post, and the water lay black and still, and nothing rang across it but the birds. That much was true in the beginning. It did not stay true. He kept to himself and kept the lock, and by the end of the first week he had begun to think the winter would pass the way still water passes, slow and gray and empty. He wound the gates once to be sure he could. He oiled the sluices. He filled the log each night in the small ledger the company kept, the way every keeper before him had, and by lamplight he read a little of what those older hands had written, the weather and the boats and the ice, going back years. He did not read far enough that first week. If he had, he might not have stayed. But the fen was quiet, and the stove was warm, and a grieving man is glad of anywhere the nights are long and no one asks him how he is. The frost came in hard on the 9th night, and with it the mist, and I want to be fair and say he did everything right at first, because it matters to what came after. He was careful. He kept the log and he kept the gates, and when the mist rolled in off the fen and swallowed the far bank and turned the whole world to a gray wall pressing on the glass, he only banked the stove higher and told himself that mist was mist, and settled in to wait out the cold. It was somewhere in the dead middle of that 9th night that the bell rang. He came awake all at once, the way you do at a sound that does not belong. It was the green bell on the upper gate. He knew it at once, the flat iron note of it carrying across the water, and it was ringing slow and steady, the way a tired man rings a bell when he has been out on cold water too long and only wants to be let through and sent on his way. And the keeper's first thought was simply that a boat had come, late and frozen, and needed the lock. So he pulled on his coat and took up the lamp and went out into the mist to do his work. The towpath was white with frost, and the mist stood so thick he could barely see the gates until he was on them. The bell was still ringing, slow and even from its post by the upper gate. He lifted the lamp and looked out over the black water above the lock, where a boat would be waiting. There was no boat, there was nothing. Only the flat black water going away into the mist and the reeds standing still, and not so much as a ripple where a hull would sit, and the bell went on ringing. He stood there a long moment with the cold coming up through his boots, and he told himself the wind was moving it. Though there was no wind, the mist hung dead still, and the reeds did not stir. He went right up to the post and he put his hand on the bell to stop it, and it was cold as the water, and it was not swinging. It hung dead on its bracket, unmoving under his hand. And still, somehow, from somewhere just behind the sound of it, the ringing went on, slow and steady and patient, out over the empty water. He took his hand away, and in the quiet after he took it away, he heard, under the ringing, another sound, a small sound, close down at the foot of the gate, of water moving, not the flat lap of the canal, a dripping, a steady thread of water running off something, down there in the dark below the towpath, in the deep stone chamber of the empty lock. He did not lower the lamp to look. Every part of him that had kept him alive that long told him not to lower the lamp and look. And he remembered standing there the old keeper's face and the one thing he had said, "You do not answer it. You do not work the gates." So he did the hard thing, which was to turn his back on a ringing bell and a sound of water in the dark and walk away from it. He went back down the frost-white path to the cottage, and he went inside, and he shut the door, and he sat by the stove with his coat still on and his hands not quite steady. And the bell rang on across the fen, slow and even, for the better part of an hour. And then, between one note and the next, it stopped. And the silence that came after was worse than the ringing, because now he was listening to it. In the morning there was frost on everything, thick and unbroken, over the towpath and the gates, and the post the bell hung on. An unbroken frost lay all along the upper bank where a boat would have moored, no rope scuff, no boot print, no mark of any living thing having come or gone in the night. But down in the deep of the lock chamber, on the wet green stone below the water line, where the frost could not reach, he found the print of a hand. A single handprint, low on the stone, as though someone down in that cold pit had reached up out of the water and taken hold and pulled and tried to climb. He told himself, through the short gray day that followed, that a man alone in the fen will hear a bell in the wind and make a boat out of mist, and see a mark on old stone and make a hand of it. He nearly believed it. But he did not sleep that day, and when the dark came down early, as it does in that country in winter, he sat by the window with the lamp turned low and watched the gates and waited, and hated that he was waiting. The bell rang again on the second night, and on the third, always in the dead middle of the night, always slow and steady and patient, always with no boat on the black water and no wind to move it. And each time he did what the old keeper had told him. He looked, and he saw nothing, and he went back in and shut the door and let it ring itself out. It was on the fourth night that he made himself take the lamp right to the edge of the lock and hold it out over the deep stone chamber and look down. The lock was drained low that night, the water sitting far down in the pit between the gates, black and skinned with ice at the edges. And down there, standing in the shallow water at the bottom of the lock, In the place where no living man could have got to with both gates shut, there was a figure. It was a man, or it had the shape of one. It stood in the black water up to its shins, quite still, with its back half toward him and its head bowed, and it was soaked through, water running off it in a steady thread, off the hem of a heavy old coat, off the ends of its hair, off its down-hanging hands, and pooling and moving around its feet in the dark. It did not shiver in the cold. It did not look up. It only stood there in the bottom of the drained lock, in the place a drowned man ends up, streaming and patient, as though it had stood there a very long time and could stand a great while longer. The keeper could not move and could not call out. He stood at the lip of the lock with the lamp shaking in his hand, and the light of it went down and touched the wet shoulders of the thing below, and slowly, so slowly, it began to lift its bowed head, and to turn it, and to raise its face up out of the dark toward the light and toward him. And he did not wait to see the face. Something older than his nerve took hold of him, and he pulled back from the edge and did not look, and he went fast down the path with the lamp swinging wild shadows across the frost, and he got inside and barred the door and stood with his back to it in the dark, his heart going like a fist on a wall. He did not go out again that night, though the bell rang on for a long while, patient and even, and near the very end of it, just before it stopped, he heard something he had not heard before from out on the towpath, close to the cottage now, closer than the gates, the small steady sound of water dripping off something as it stood in the frozen dark outside his door. It did not knock. It did not try the latch. It only stood there dripping for a moment or two. And then the bell stopped, and the dripping stopped, and it was gone. In the morning there was a wet mark on the frost outside his door, a dark patch where the frost had melted and refrozen, exactly the size and shape of a man standing still. He stood over it a long time. Then he went inside and he took down the old company log, the one that went back years in many hands, and he sat by the stove, and he did the only thing left to do. He began at last to read it properly, from the back toward the front, looking for the thing he was afraid he would find. The log of Harrow Lock went back a great many years, in the hands of every keeper who had ever wound those gates, and most of it was the plain, slow business of the water, the frost, the thaw, the boats, the endless keeping of the level. He read it backward night after night now, from the recent empty winters toward the older, busier years, and near the middle of it the entries changed hands and the writing grew careful and unhappy, and there he found the winter it had all begun. There had been a keeper on the lock long before, a man who had kept it through a hard winter much like this one, and the entries let slip, a man who kept it with his young son, the two of them alone out on the fen after the boy's mother had died. And the story of them, as the keeper pieced it together from that man's own hand, and from what the old keeper told him later at the thaw, put into my own words, was this. There had come a night, that winter of the worst cold in living memory, when the canal froze thick, and a late boat came down the water in trouble, iced up and low, ringing the bell to be let through before she was crushed in the freeze. And the keeper had gone out to work the gates and save her. It was heavy work for one man in the dark in the ice, winding the great gates and the sluices, and he had set his boy to help him, to run along the chamber wall in the dark with a lamp, and watch the water and call up when the level was right. And somewhere in the black middle of that night's work, with the water roaring in through the sluices and rising fast in the lock, and the father hauling at the gate handles too busy to look, the boy on the wet chamber wall had slipped, and gone down into the rising water in the pit of the lock, and been carried under in the dark, in the roar, while his father wound the gates not 20 feet away and heard nothing over the water until it was long past too late. What the log recorded, in a hand that fell to pieces line by line, was that the father drained the lock at dawn and went down into it and brought his boy up out of the cold water at the bottom, and that he never in his life forgave himself for the winding of those gates. He wrote that he had not been watching, that he had been too busy saving strangers to watch his own. And in the last entries, barely writing at all, he wrote that on the frozen nights he could hear the boy still out at the gates, ringing the bell the way he used to, calling to be let through, calling for his father to come and work the lock and bring him up out of the water. And that the worst of it, the very worst, was that the boy did not seem to know that he had drowned, that he only knew he was cold and down in the dark and waiting at the gate for someone to come and let him through. And there in the log in that ruined hand, the keeper found the boy's name. Just the once, written the way a father writes a name he cannot bear to write, the name he had called down into the water that night, over and over, drained the lock and called and got no answer. The keeper read the name by the low lamp, and he understood then what stood in the bottom of the lock and what rang the bell and what dripped outside his door in the frozen dark. It was not hunting him. It had never been hunting him. It was a cold and frightened child, dead 100 years, still standing at the gate in the dark, still ringing the bell, still waiting for a father who had gone off down the towpath long ago and was never, ever coming back to let him through. He closed the book. Outside, the mist had come down again with the falling dark, and out at the gates, patient and slow, the green bell had begun once more to ring, and he understood it now. That was the thing that broke him a little, sitting there by the stove. He understood it perfectly. The last night was the coldest of the winter, and he knew it would be the worst of them, because it began the way the old keeper's worst nights had begun, with a true hard freeze, and a mist off the fen, and the ice creeping in from the banks until the whole black width of the canal lay still and white and waiting. The bell began early that night, before he had even lit the lamp, and it did not ring the way it had rung before. It rang fast, urgent, the frightened, hurrying peal of a child who has been left too long in the dark and has begun, at last, to be truly afraid. Over and over, no pause in it now, the flat iron note going out across the frozen water like something calling for help and running out of time to be helped. And as he stood at the window with the cold coming through the glass, he saw, out at the lock, that the water had begun to rise. It should not have risen. The sluices were shut and had been shut for weeks, and there was no boat and no thaw and no reason on this earth for the black water in the chamber to climb. But climb it did, slow and steady and wrong, up the green stone of the empty lock, up toward the lip and the towpath and the top of the gates, the way it must have climbed that other night, long ago, with the sluices roaring and a child down in the dark of it. And he understood, sick and cold at the window, what the night was doing. It was not showing him a memory. It was living it again. The lock was filling, the way it had filled the night the boy went down, and somewhere in that rising black water a frightened child was going under one more time, and ringing and calling to be let through before the water closed over him. And that was when the cold came up the path to the door. He heard it, the small steady drip of water off something standing in the frozen dark outside, right up against the wood now, closer than it had ever come. And this time it did not simply stand. This time, at last, it knocked. A small sound, low down on the door, about the height a child's hand would reach. A knock and a pause and a knock again, patient and cold and terribly polite, the way a well-brought-up child knocks when he has been taught to knock and wait. A child standing soaked and freezing at a stranger's door in the middle of the worst night of the year, asking, in the only way he had left, to be let in out of the water and the dark. Everything the old keeper had told him said not to open the door. Do not answer it. Do not work the gates. Do not open the lock to an empty chamber. And every rule of every keeper who had come before him had been built on that one hard law that you keep the door shut, and you let it ring itself out, and you do not, whatever it seems to be asking, let the drowned thing in. His hand, he told me, was on the latch before he knew he had crossed the room. Out at the gates the bell rang faster and faster, and the water climbed the stone, and low on the door, just below his hand on the latch, the small cold knock came again. And he stood there in the dark with everything he had been warned about pulling one way, and the sound of a frightened child on the far side of an inch of wood pulling the other. What decided him in the end was not courage, and it was not the rules. It was the name. It rose up in him from the log by the light of the stove. The name a father had called down into the water 100 years ago and never once been answered, and he understood, with his hand on the cold latch, that every keeper who had come after had kept the door shut, and let the bell ring out and gone back to the stove, and left that child standing in the water in the dark for another 100 years. They had done the safe thing. They had done the thing they were told, and the boy was still out there, cold and frightened and waiting, because in all that time not one of them had done the one thing he was actually asking for. Not one of them had ever answered him. Not one of them had ever said his name. So the keeper did the thing that no one had told him he was allowed to do. He did not open the door, but he leaned his head against the cold wood, close to where the small knock had come, and out loud in the dark, with the bell ringing and the water rising, he spoke the boy's name, the name from the log, the one his father had drowned trying to call, and he said the rest of it as gently as he could through the wood. That he had heard him. That he knew he was cold, and that he knew he was frightened, and that he was so very sorry no one had come. That his father had not left him, not really, that his father had loved him and grieved him and looked for him in that black water until it took his mind. And that it was over now. That the water was cold and it was dark and it was long past time, but he could stop ringing now. He could stop waiting at the gate. He could let go of the stone and let the water take him the rest of the way home and be at peace, because someone had finally come, and someone had finally said his name, and someone was finally, after 100 years, letting him through. And the bell stopped. It did not ring itself out, slow and patient, the way it always had. It simply stopped all at once between one note and the next, the way a held breath is let go. And out at the lock the risen water made no sound at all. And low on the door where the small cold knock had been, there came instead a different thing, a light pressure against the wood, soft and warm and brief, the way a tired child leans his forehead on a door for a moment before he is carried up to bed. It rested there. And then it was gone, and the drip of water off the frozen dark outside came slower and slower and stopped, and the deep cold that had stood at that door all winter went out of the night and did not come back. When the gray light came up at last over the fen, he opened the door on a still, clear morning, the mist all gone and the frost lying soft and unbroken and clean. The water in the lock had settled back down to its winter level, low and quiet and black. And on the wet green stone at the bottom where he had seen the figure stand, there was nothing now, no handprint, no dripping thing, no cold and waiting child. Only the water lying still, and the ice going gold at the edges as the sun came over the reeds. He stood there a long time in the doorway. Then he went and rang the green bell himself once softly out over the empty water. For nobody. Just so a bell would ring at that lock one more time and mean nothing but goodbye. He kept the rest of the winter at Harrow Lock, and the bell never rang again on its own. And when the old keeper came back at the thaw, he found the new man changed. Quieter, but easier somehow, like a man who had set down a weight he had been carrying long before he ever came to the fen. He never took another posting on the water. But he told me he was glad to the end of his life that he had been the one out there that winter, that a grieving man had been the one to hear it, because he thought that maybe you need to have carried a loss of your own to understand what the boy was really asking. Not to be let through a lock, to be told that someone knew he was there, that the keeping of a place is not only in the shutting of the door against the dark, that sometimes it is in the answering. I've thought a good deal about why he told me all of this, and I think it comes down to the part he could not leave alone, that for 100 years, keeper after keeper had done everything right and shut the door and been safe and left a child to freeze in the dark. Because the safe thing and the right thing are not always the same thing, and it can take a whole life to tell them apart. And somewhere out in the flat country tonight, at some forgotten lock on some black stretch of old water, a bell may still be ringing, slow and patient, on a night with no boat. And if you ever hear it, if you ever stand at the dark edge of still water and hear something small and cold ask to be let through, I hope you will remember this, that not everything waiting in the dark wants to hurt you. Some of it is only lost and frightened and a very long way from home, and has been waiting all this time for one person with the heart to stop and listen and answer it kindly. That's where I'll leave him and leave you, with a bell gone quiet at last, and a name said out loud in the dark, and a child let through after 100 cold years. Some things are kept safe not by the ones who bar the door, but by the ones brave enough to open their hearts to what is knocking. If you'd sit up in the dark for a story like this, then do me a kindness before you go, like, share, and subscribe, so the next one finds its way to you when the mist comes down. Sleep well if you can. Keep a light burning if you'd rather. And if you ever wake in the small hours to a sound out beyond the window, a bell, maybe, slow and patient over still water, or a small cold knock low on the door, do the hard thing, not the safe thing. Listen. And if what is out there is only lost and cold and asking to come home, then be the one at last who answers it kindly. Good night.